I do want to invite now Avi Douglen, which is a very close friend and a colleague. I think the second person that I'm seeing in every conference is Avi for a long time, and he also invite me to the OWASP, which is the Open Web Application Security Project, a very known organization.
Open worldwide application.
Open worldwide, sorry, Open Worldwide Application Security Project. Thank you for that, Avi.
It's not
Uh,
just web.
no, as the chairman of OWASP, you need to, correct me when I'm wrong. That's okay. So yes, Avi is also the chairman of OWASP, so this is why I'm meeting him on every occasion, OWASP and other cybersecurity conference. Avi is also the CEO of BounceSecurity with vast knowledge in application security, threat modeling, um, very talented person, I can tell you, from one-to-one meeting that we have and still having. And actually, Avi will talk about advancing the state of threat modeling, which is the proper way to assess if your code, your architecture, your design system, your LLM, your everything is being designed in a secure manner. Even if it was still developed or you are stunting at development, threat modeling will be the tool to detect security vulnerabilities in your system, though I don't want to elaborate on that because this is what Avi will talk about in his presentation. So Avi, you have the control. Um, Feel free to start.
Cool. Thanks a lot, Lior. That's a very, very warm welcome. Always nice to be welcomed by people I know. Yes, we're going to talk about threat modeling, and just in case there are folks that are not familiar with threat modeling, I'm going to give you a high-level introduction to what threat modeling is and how to go about it. Start working. Um, and we're going to talk a little bit about that, just very introductory level, because then we want to talk about how to get to a more advanced level of threat modeling. This was actually the request from by Lior in the first place to talk about how to get to more advanced threat modeling. And the first thought is, let's get deeper, let's get more technical, let's get really down and you know what? There's a bit of a spoiler for what I'm coming through, and I hope my co-speakers don't get insulted by this. I'm going to say a little bit controversial. It's not about technology. It's not about tools. It's about the people, dummy. And that's what we're going to be seeing. We're going to be touching on this. And assuming you're doing threat modeling, you may have had some struggling to get it to be better. How do you produce more value from that? How do you get everybody doing this? And this is what we're going to be talking about. Here we go. So, quick introduction to myself. My name is Avi Douglen. As Lior said, you see my ticker face bouncing around the internet. Get in touch with me if you want. If we ever meet in person and the mood strikes you to buy me a drink, you should know I like my whiskey smoky, I like my beer stout, and I like really black strong coffee. You don't have to, but it's always appreciated. I do have quite a few kids at home, so I always appreciate these drinks. More to the point, as Leo said, I do product software security or product security consulting at BounceSecurity. We're a small boutique, do research, development, security architecture, things like that. I advise a bunch of startups. I'm one of the leaders of the OWASP Israel chapter, of course, a very active chapter. I think it's the second largest in the world. We have meetups here every month. If you're located here, come join us. Should have a nice big conference next year as well. I am on the board of directors and actually the chair of the board, as Lior said this year. It was my turn. We always have to do it. I got suckered into it. I'm also one of the co-founder and one of the project leaders for the OWASP threat modeling project. It will start rising pretty soon. We have some big plans for it. I'm also the community moderator on Security Stack Exchange. I don't know if anybody's familiar with that. I'm sure you're familiar with Stack Overflow. So Security Stack Exchange is kind of like Stack Overflow. It's exactly like it's literally Stack Overflow, but a sister site for security. It's a great resource. Check it out, question and answers. I'm also one of the co-authors of the Threat Modeling Manifesto. Feel free to go check it out. It's a free resource, threatmodelingmanifesto.org. You could read it in 7 minutes, twice. But we're actually going to be talking about that quite a bit because the Threat Modeling Manifesto group is a group of 15 to 20, depending on what point in time, 15 to 20 brilliant folks throughout the world, and me as well, joined together to really define what threat modeling is, what really should be. I'm going to talk about a little bit about what that means and why that's so complicated to actually define and what that is. And a second part of that is the work that I'm going to be talking about today as well. So threat modeling comes down to answering the basic common question that we always have throughout the security industry. Our hardest question is, how secure is secure enough? Because nobody wants to be wasting time and resources and just doing more security just for the hell of it because we're purists and we really believe in it strongly. You can't convince the organization for that. You can't convince your executives to that. You can't convince the developers to be doing that unless you have a really good reason for it, right? Because how often do we just spend too much time doing security and wrong security, and we just waste our time because we don't get hacked anyway? Well, good security is when you don't know that you have it or not, right? But it's really hard to prove that. Or the other side of that is what happens if we don't spend enough time on security, enough resources on it, and then we get breached, we get hacked or fined. Sometimes that can be worse, right? Even worse and more likely is actually both. We spend too much time doing security, but it's the wrong security, and therefore we will still get hacked anyway. So we wasted time and didn't have the impact that we want. It's what happens when you follow the book of best practices. Because what somebody else is doing is not the same thing that you're doing. Sure, we're all building software, we're all doing the same kinds of online shops, but we're all doing it in subtly different ways. And if we try to follow the same recipe as everybody else, we're going to get different results. And if you just blindly follow that without any situational awareness, that's the holes you're going to fall into. It's kind of like if you're thinking that there's a spectrum, more security, less security, right? And we just want to hopefully find that one magical point of that's the right amount of security. More than that is waste. Less than that we get hacked. We'll just land on that. Except it's not like the spectrum. It's not like ketchup, right? Some people like more ketchup on their food. Some people like less, and just find the right amount. It's not like that. It's not more or less. It's not binary. It really is more like a multifaceted, multi-dimensional, constantly changing sphere of, I don't even know what to call this shape, but this is kind of what security for our systems really looks like, because it changes over time and you have infinite different perspectives. I'd rather think of it in terms of this. Those of you not familiar with this nice little graphic, it's a diagram of a World War II bomber. Now, a little bit of color. Back in World War II, the Allied bombing effort was, of course, a huge deal because that's the way they're going about it, except that they noticed that around 25% of the bombers didn't make it back. Huge amounts of anti-aircraft fire, flak, everything going on over Central Europe. This is what they wanted to put more armor on the planes. Great, obviously we want to protect our planes, we want to protect our bombers. Except they're, putting armor on the entire plane is too expensive, it's too slow, it's too heavy. It'd be like flying a tank, not very practical. So like any good engineer, you start by collecting some information. They started by doing some data analysis, right? And every red dot here is effectively a statistically significant amount of bullet holes or flak, whatever happened on every plane that came back. And they started measuring this over time. All the planes that came back, they start looking where the bullet holes are. Makes perfect sense. You want to put armor on the bullet holes and protect the planes from anti-aircraft fire. Unfortunately, they fell into a very common trap. Luckily, right before they went and implemented this plan, a Jewish-Hungarian statistician by the name of Abraham Vold pointed out that they fell into a very common cognitive bias called survivor's bias. They were only looking at the planes that came back. They missed the point. The bullet holes are not the problem. The planes crashing and exploding, that's the problem. This is a perfect map of where you don't need to put armor. because every one of these bullet holes is a spot that the plane can take a shot and still make its way back. You patch it up, swap out the crew, refuel it, throw up more ammunition, and fly back out. Quick round turns. So this is a perfect map of what doesn't actually matter to us. And very often we fall into the same kind of cognitive traps when we look at our systems. Oh, we look at our logs, we look at threat intel. These are the attacks that have been happening, and we survived. We detected it, and nothing bad happened. Great, then don't pay more attention to that. Look at all the things that actually matter to you as a business. What are the types of attacks that would cause your business to actually crash and not recover? So it's always about understanding the business value of the things that you're trying to prevent against, right? And understanding what you need to be doing going forward, right? And of course, this matters, right? Because it's basically non-functional requirements, okay? It's about upfront design, as Lior mentioned. We want to predict the things that will go wrong in our system before we even build it. And we want to know, and we want to enable development teams to be able to know, product teams to know what kind of security we should be working on and how much security is enough, right? And that's where threat modeling comes in. It doesn't remove work, but it helps us focus on what really matters. So what is threat modeling? It's basically a framework to think about threats, to talk about what matters, to have a structured analysis of the security aspects of the system by looking at the design and the architecture of the system, and basically to help you prioritize what really matters. A more formal definition, which is very generic by the Threat Modeling Manifesto group, is analyzing representations of a system, representations, i.e., diagrams, some kind of model, not the running application itself, to highlight concerns, not necessarily a long list of threats, just the issues that we want to fix about security and privacy characteristics. The emphasis here is mine, of course, but we want to focus on what are the issues we want to fix. What are the things that we want to do something about? Okay, this little definition here took the 15 of us about 3 weeks to define, because that's what happens when you get a lot of really smart people in a room. But the point is, there are a lot of different ways of doing threat modeling, right? Software-centric, asset-centric, focusing on the attacker, risk-based threat modeling. My personal approach is value-driven threat modeling, but there's a lot of different ways to do this. Some of the methods are good, many are bad. Quite a few are deceptively simple and look good, but don't actually scale well. And that's kind of a bit of a trap as well. And that's exactly what we want to be talking about in just a few moments about that. Because whatever approach you take to doing threat modeling, it all comes down to answering the 4 key questions, what is sometimes known as Adam Shostak's 4-question framework. And you can find this in that manifesto as well. What are we working on? That's the first question. This is the design of the system, the architecture. What are you implementing? It's not necessarily the code you're writing, but whatever it is you're working on. Number 2, what can go wrong? These are the threats, the things that we're looking to fix. What can break? What are we going to do about it, right? Countermeasures. Obviously, just finding threats isn't the big thing. We want to produce a more secure product. And finally, did we do a good job? Consider this kind of like QA for any software design process, kind of a retrospective, and is the process good? One way of finding threats is known as STRIDE, sometimes known as the Microsoft model. Is about 25 years old, and it still lasts, it still works. STRIDE is a mnemonic that stands for spoofing, tapping, remediation, information disclosure, live service elevation, and privileges. It's not that important right now. It's just a conceptual framework to look for the different aspects, the different types of attacks in a system. 6 different categories of types of threats that can affect your system. Now, once you find a threat, it doesn't matter what category or bucket it fits into, it's just a conceptual framework to help you elicitate the different types of threats that you're looking for, right? So spoofing, you'll be looking for attacks on the different aspects of identity in the system. Tampering threats affect the different pieces in the system that have a high integrity. requirement, whether it's the code or the data, and so on. Repudiation are attacks on provability. Information disclosure are attacks on confidentiality. Denial of service, obviously, attacks on availability, and elevation of privileges are attacks on, well, limitations on authority, right? Now, it's really, really important before we go forward. This is all just really introductory threat modeling stuff, but I really need to point out something that George Box, a known statistician, doesn't quite say. I'm misquoting. All threat models are wrong. Some are useful. It's not about finding the 100% absolutely correct threat model. The original quote was all models. By definition, it's a model. It is not accurately representative. It just needs to be useful. Useful in this case, helping us build a more secure product. And we can accept that the model is going to be wrong. What matters here is the usefulness. And we're going to lead on that. Why is that important? Going to borrow some patterns from the manifesto. It helps us find what's wrong. It helps us just make better decisions throughout time. And it helps us find the things that and focus on the issues that we want to mitigate. A couple of other things from the manifesto. I'm not going to read through the whole thing, but there are a lot of really good design patterns designed for your threat modeling practice, systemic approach, informed creativity, and so on. Really useful. Again, take a look at the manifesto. There are also some really nice anti-patterns. Again, not going to read through the whole thing, but one of my favorite here is Hero Threat Modeler. This is a really common anti-pattern, and the reason I love this so much is because I have been that one person that's responsible for threat modeling, and everybody else doesn't need to worry about it, but that's not the way it is. It's a massive mistake, a really common trap, that the one person is doing the threat modeling as opposed to the whole team. Whatever you're working on, thinking in that model of what are we working on, how does that work, what can go wrong, and so on. There are a bunch of other best practices that are really important, specifically to create having an outcome of the threat modeling. It has to be valuable. You have to create some value to those that care about it. And threat modeling, when you take everything else away, leave one thing, it's about the dialogue. Get the people in the room talking about what matters, right? And that is what produces the value. You can document it, make sure that we understood it correctly. We can measure this over time, but it's about the dialogue. It's about getting people in the room talking about it. Another really important best practice, and here's where we're starting to get to the more advanced stuff. It's about the culture of finding and fixing design issues. Now, the focus here is the fixing design issues and not just checkbox compliance. But a really important point here is culture. It has to be, that's just the way we do things here. Really hard to define culture. You can go to scientists and academics. It's really hard to define what culture is, and especially an organizational culture. But for our purposes, you could think of security culture is what happens when the security team isn't in the room. So if you have a good culture of the product team and the developers are actively, by default, just that's the way we do things here, looking to find and fix the design issues without anybody having to chase them. That's what we're looking for. That is the best kind of threat modeling. And both Tamir and Lior talked about people, process, and tools, and people and collaboration. That's the most important part. Process, methodologies, tools, all that stuff helps, but it's about the people, right? Culture is people. And Lior kind of stole my thunder on that thunder, right? It's a little bit about the technology, a bit more about the process, but it's mostly about the people, right? With all that being said, that manifesto group got together while after that manifesto was published to create what's known as the threat modeling capabilities, right? The threat modeling manifesto is very generic, very high level, very not exactly defined. It's more what you want to have and not how to do it or even what that looks like. So we got together to define a set of capabilities, right, for not the threat model itself, but for the overall practice. We're doing threat modeling in our organization. What's our methodology? What's our process? What's our practice? And all that, right? And when you have a lot of these capabilities, in your practice, that's when you know you're actually producing a lot more value. If you're missing something, we're doing threat modeling, but without all these capabilities, well, then it's probably not that practical, and that might help you identify what you're missing, why it's harder, what are you struggling with. So you can create a roadmap to create a better threat modeling program and improve your practice, or you can use these capabilities to identify how your practice actually is. What's better? What are you struggling with? Why is this not working? This will help you by implementing these capabilities. It will help you find and meet those objectives. It will help you avoid all the common traps that I often talk about, like the hero threat modeler, right? Well, what actually is a capability, right? This is not a maturity model. It just is. You either have it or you don't, right? You either are able to do a thing or you're not able to do a thing. These are binary. You either do the thing or not. The capability framework here does not say a word about how to implement these things, just that you do implement it, right? There could be varying levels of success. There could be varying levels of quality. It doesn't matter, right? And it's not linear. You don't go the first A, B, C, and so on. It's all in parallel, whatever you can. So you can absolutely, I'm going to talk a few seconds about how to implement a program that meets these capabilities, but you don't need to worry about the order of it, whatever makes sense for you. Now, it's really important these capabilities can be measurable, they should be provable, but it doesn't matter how much, right? It's yes or no, it's not how much do you have, right? That matters, but that's not what you're going to find in the capabilities, right? It has to be actionable, something that we could do or implement to be able to meet that capability. And the capability framework will also describe and explain why that is and what you need to do for it. And again, it's not guidance. It doesn't show, it's not prescriptive as how to do it, just that you do something for that. Okay. And again, you can check this out at threatmodeling.org/capabilities. You'll find that a long list. Now I want to talk through the different process areas really quickly. Okay? I'm not going to read this out to you. That wouldn't be very educational, wouldn't be very valuable. You can just read it yourself. But I want to talk a little bit about each of these process areas to try and give you a feel for what these capabilities are and why it's important to go and do this. And again, this is not coming just from Avi, from my own personal experience. In the past, I've built threat modeling programs. I've implemented these at a whole bunch of different companies. And I would say I probably met less than 2/3 of these because I didn't have a cohesive, structured framework for this, relying on everybody else's experience. And that's what we have here in the capabilities framework. So I'm going to go really quickly through the different process areas and touch a little bit on some of them. Excuse me. So our first process area is strategy. Okay? Strategy is basically, does the organization buy into this idea of threat modeling and doing mature advanced threat modeling? And if we buy into the idea, do we actually put our money where our mouth is, right? Is there executive buy-in? Do we build our processes accordingly? Do we actually spend enough to actually get this done? Very straightforward, very simple. If you do not have these, you might have a decent threat modeling practice at the grassroots level. You might find somebody squeezing in time and back alleys and in their breaks and overnight without any actual approval to spend time on it, because it does take time. Yeah, it's more efficient, but it does take time to invest in doing this. But if you have executive buy-in, if you invest in it, then you'll get to where you're really going. The next practice area is education, because of course you can't do a good threat modeling if everybody involved doesn't know how to do it, right? So you got things like training assignment. You got to know that people actually have that training, right? The training needs to be adapted to each person's role and technology and workflow and all that. One of the things that is really important to me is active practice. You can't learn to do threat modeling from a book or a video. Well, I mean, you can, I did, just not very well, right? You need to actually do the threat modeling to get better at it. And the manifesto itself also says that doing threat modeling is better than talking about it, which I tend to do more often than anything else. But if you want to get better at it, you need to do it. You can't learn to cook from a book. You can learn recipes, you get ideas, but it means nothing until you start actually doing it and you learn how to do the things by practice and seeing what it actually means. Same thing with threat modeling. You need support for the training. You need to have the training change over time, continuing education. You need to have it aligned with the actual business, the way your organization works, aligned to the conventions of how you work. And the education and the training needs to fit the organization and support that. And when everybody knows how to do it, there's a better chance you're doing it better, obviously, right? It's the way to maximize your chances of having a better, more valuable threat modeling practice because everybody knows what to do. The next practice area is the process area is actually the biggest one, unsurprisingly, because it's all about how to create a threat model. This is the core, this is the doing part, right? But even here, we have a bunch of different capabilities. So for example, when we're doing the threat modeling, do we have somebody that knows what they're doing? And again, if you just did the training and nothing else, you're not going to really be a valuable, you're not going to be able to lead a valuable threat modeling exercise. I always ask a question. This is a bit of a trick question, and feel free to quickly type your answer in the chat box. What system is the hardest one to threat model? I'm going to give you a few seconds if you want to drop your answer into the chat box, because I said it's a bit of a trick question, because the hardest system to threat model is your first one. Once you've done this a few times, it becomes incredibly easier because you're familiar with the process. The first time you do it, it will feel weird. You won't understand, and you'll start tripping on every little thing and not know if you're going too deep or not deep enough. What you'll be. You do it once, you have somebody that has gone through this as a partner to take you through it, and it will be a lot easier. So you need to have, sorry, so you need to have a practitioner that has that experience together with you, whether it's facilitating or backing up and so on, right? There are a few other capabilities, right? You want to have active participation, right? It's not a one directional activity. It's a team sport, right? It's everybody's responsibility. The manifesto has a question, whose responsibility is it? And it's really a kind of snarky answer is you. It's your responsibility. If you're involved in building a product, you're responsible for it, right? Um, Active collaboration, right? We want everybody involved in this. We want to be prioritized according to the most important things, not, oh, I just made the button blue and moved it 2 inches to the left. It doesn't matter, right? We want to focus on what really matters. Prioritization for threat modeling is a core part of it. And we want to make sure that we're doing the right level of analysis to understand the actual system, to have a shared understanding of how it works, what matters, which threats actually are important. But there are more creation capabilities, right? It's about an ongoing practice. This is not a one-time thing. Do we build up these design patterns or threat patterns over time about similar things that we've built and used, right? Can we compare threat models between different systems, different features? We need to have some kind of consistency there, right? We're constantly changing our software, so our threat model needs to constantly be changing, right? And then there's the higher level of treat the threat models as part of the design. Do you track versions of them? Can you roll back to understand what happened in the past, right? How do you share and distribute these threat models with the rest of the stakeholders? And now here's one that actually is technology oriented. I think this might be the only one. Tools. Tools are important. Tools cannot do the threat modeling for you. No, not even AI. It can find a checklist of the generic low-hanging fruit, common stuff, but tools are incredibly useful. Now, it should be pointed out, when we're talking about threat modeling tools and threat modeling products, there's a variety of tools and what they do, right? It could be tools to create the models for you automatically. It could be tools to generate the threats for you. It could be tools to distribute those threats and manage the threat models themselves as artifacts. It could be a combination of those. It could be distributing the countermeasures to the threats to the developers in their Jira and the test platform as you go. So it could be a variety of these things. A threat modeling tool is not one thing, but none of them actually solve getting everybody in the room to talk about security that matters. But tools help. We have action capabilities, right? Or acting on the threat model. I prefer to think about this in terms of response. We created this threat model. What do we do with it, right? You got your definition of done. You want to be aligned to workflows. You want to make sure that we actually do something with the output of that threat model, right? We want to have an incremental improvement. We want to improve our development process over time. I did a threat model. I found a whole bunch of stuff. How do I change my design flows for next time so that we get better? Risk management, of course, and so on. We can't continue without talking about communications, because when you remove all the cruft, threat modeling, more than anything else, is not a technical exercise, it's communications. It's getting what's inside my head and getting what's inside your head and sharing that, getting that shared understanding, right? And this is absolutely not a technical thing. This is 100% people. This is culture. And if you have a really good organizational culture that does this, you're probably in a good spot when it comes to threat modeling. Most of these things here are not specific to threat modeling. And if you have a toxic culture in your organization, if you have an organization that doesn't do so good with the communications and the people skills, well, then you're going to have trouble. You're going to have challenges when you get to threat modeling as well. So it's things like positive reinforcement. We find threats. That's not attacking the person. That's not saying, I broke your stuff. You did a sucky job. No, of course not. Developing people skills, tight feedback loops, constructive conversations. All these things have very little to do with threat modeling and everything to do with threat modeling. Diverse viewpoints. We always say, get all the different stakeholders in the room, right? Cross-functional teams. We want to have all these different perspectives. We also need to talk about measurement. Just today, I heard somebody talking about a massive worldwide organization talking about, well, how do we know when we've threat modeled enough? How do we know when to stop, right? And what else do we do? How do we know that we're doing a good job here, right? So this is where the measurement capabilities come in. Are we producing value, and how, right? Do we track status of the threat model, of the outcomes, of the mitigations and the fixes, and so on? Are we able to quantify this in any way? Are we able to feed back into that risk management based on what we found in the threat models? Finally, the last process area is the program management. It's just about the umbrella definition of the process, right? Do we manage this overall program based on the value that we create from the threat modeling, right? Do we change the program over time, the program or practice or threat modeling methodology, whatever you want to call this? Do we change this over time with small changes, because small changes can get adopted, right? Do we have a variety of flexible methodology? Do we change things over time? Because not every software change is the same, right? Well, making that button blue and moving it 2 inches to the left is not the same thing as adding a whole new payment process. And they should have a completely different approach when we come to threat modeling. They both should have some threat modeling, but completely different levels. Do we manage based on metrics? Do we change the program based on what works, what doesn't, what has impact, what has value, and so on? And do we develop this together, collaboratively? That's the key word here, right? Threat modeling is about collaboration between everybody. So these are the process areas, right? And again, it's a list of capabilities. Do you have this in your organization? Yes or no? Now, of course, there is a wide range for most of these of between not zero and 100% it's actually really perfect. And it doesn't matter because right now, not zero is worlds better than zero, right? And I would rather get not zero on everything than perfect on some and absolutely nothing on others. So when we come to actually implement this, coming back to the process areas, right? I would urge you all to take a look at this. If you're not doing any threat modeling in your organization, I would suggest to start small with something. Don't even worry about the capabilities because again, this is the advanced topic, right? It's advanced threat modeling practice. You don't need to worry about that. If you do have threat modeling in your organization, it's good, it's bad, we're struggling. I say we do it, nobody else is actually doing it. Wherever you are, I would urge you to take a look at some of these capabilities. You might get some good ideas, right? It's not a scorecard that you need to score 100 and report it publicly or anything like that, but take a look at them and see where you have room for improvement. You might find that you're really, really strong on education, but nobody actually does things, right? Or you might find, oh yes, everybody fills out these threat modeling templates, but nobody does. But then afterwards, oh, we just stick them in a folder. Nobody looks at them. It's write only. Nobody bothers changing anything. Well, okay, then you want to be focusing on the acting on threat models area, right? And of course, communications is really organizational and so on. So you can take a look at these capabilities and go through that just to kind of score yourself to see which areas you're stronger in, which areas need more work. And if you're trying to create a whole new practice by yourself, well, then this should give you some guidance of how to make a really robust, powerful threat modeling practice, which both gets implemented in practice by all the teams and produces the value that makes it worthwhile to go through this effort. That's what I am calling advanced threat modeling. Thank you very much. Open for questions. I saw some comments there.
Yes, there are several questions. I will start. Zachau is asking, what will be the tool recommended to do a threat modeling as a regular task for team members? Do you have any recommendations?
For tools, I can give you a wide range, starting from a whiteboard and colored markers. Literally get everybody in the room and talk about what matters. That's where it starts. There are some really nice platforms out there. On the board of advisors for one vendor. I'm close friends with two other vendors. And there's a couple of other products that I really like. I'm not going to mention commercial products. I will mention the OWASP Threat Dragon, free open source, obviously, project. It helps you draw some diagrams in a structured way. It helps you answer some questions in a better way. Kind of like what used to be Microsoft threat modeling, just better and useful, unlike the Microsoft threat modeling tool. Yeah.
Okay. I can share that I call the threat modeling as a penetration test on paper. So this is the methodology. You want to hack your system, your design, try to find those flaws in security as much as you can, of course, in the early stages of the development, but it could be occurred on every development stage, of also post-production and after, of course, but you want to find it in the early stage. Another question from Eduard. How do we measure threat modeling value when performed on an existing application against pen test? Okay, and more generally, what are the most used indicators to evaluate the outcomes?
That's a fantastic question. I'll start with, I don't think our industry has actually discovered the full comprehensive generic answer to that. That said, right, you actually have a couple of questions here, right? How do you measure value? I measure value as time spent, everybody's time, versus improvement in the security of your software.
Mm.
That's how I measure it. That's the bottom line, right? That's how you know it's valuable. Is it worth doing this? Now, the second part of that is really hard because, well, how many things do we fix? How much do we change our conceptual model for everybody, our shared understanding? We have a different way of approaching the product. Both of those, all of those, changing the product over time, absolutely. But if you want to compare that against pen testing, well, then you have kind of a wider question there of, well, how do you measure the value of pen testing? Um, I'm a skeptic, so I'll say, well, with monopoly money. Um, but realistically, you still have the same question. How much time did you spend building the system insecurely, plus how much you paid for the pen test, right? Plus the time that it takes you to fix it, plus the amount of time those vulnerabilities have been out in the wild. As far as the most used indicators, it's really hard to define this, to the best of my knowledge, in any more formal way than how much better are we getting versus how much time are we spending.
Mhm. Okay. I can tell you moreover that a good KPI with from my vast knowledge is to see how many defects you found. So if you find a defect in the latest stage of the development or even in the production, what will be the cost of fixing those defects? And a measurement could be to reduce the amount of defects over time. This is how you can measure and, of course, be efficient, because if you find those defects in the early stage, you will not need to waste lots of budget, resource, and other to fix defects in production, which cost you a lot more, of course.
And I absolutely agree with that. I just want to point out one really important nuance about that. Obviously, it's not just the number. You find 100 low risk versus 3 high risk. Obviously, you should be focusing on more on the high risk, and those have more impact than the low risk, obviously. But more to that, it's not uh, when you find one issue in threat modeling, very often this actually hides a handful of defects that you might find in pen testing, right? So it's not just, I completely agree with what you say, Lior, but it's not just the pile of defects that you fixed, but it's also the changes and improvements to the security design.
I fully agree with you. Tov, so there is another question. What is your advice, Avi, for developers, not security people, on how to decide what should be threat modeled? Like on how to, on or what should we do on the threat modeling process?
I'm going to take that question and expand it a bit because, like I said, you might have a variety of approaches, right? You might have a high-end, full comprehensive threat model versus more lightweight, right? So everything should be some threat modeled. But that might just be, let's spend 3 minutes asking a couple of security relevant questions, and then we get to the conclusion that there's nothing there. So it's not just yes or no, it's how much should we be spending. I've come I've come to like this idea that I like to call sorry points, kind of like story points. Developers in the audience will sure are familiar with that. Story points measure how much effort a specific user story or feature would take compared to some other generic, other baseline story or feature, right? It's not how long it is, it's how much effort. Very roughly. Yeah, some people use a Fibonacci sequence, so it's incrementally larger, right? Some people, most teams I've seen use t-shirt sizes. This is a small story size, a story points, or medium, large, and so on. So I use it the same way as sorry points. How sorry would we be if this feature explodes in our face in the most wonderfully Murphy-like way, right? And I can give you a few qualifying questions like how exposed is this to the internet? How many users use this? Is it like 5% or 100% for your user base, right? 2 users or 2 million, right? What kind of sensitive data does this have? What side effects does it have? How complicated is the feature in the first place, right? How relevant would that be, right? So based on a few contextual questions, you can very quickly get to a certain level of sorry points. it's a risk indicator. It's not the actual impact, right? And based on that, you can then break it up. Well, if it's a small story points or small risk, well, then we'll only do a little bit, really lightweight. Maybe we'll stick something in the user story, right? On the higher end, well, let's do something comprehensive. Let's bring in the experts like Lior to help us with this and do the full threat modeling, or somewhere in between. Maybe you want a value-driven approach. Do a value chain analysis as part of your product specification, your feature specification. So this idea of sorry points or risk indicators helps you kind of level set how much effort you should be applying to that feature based on a few qualifying questions.
Interesting. I will take the sorry point. That's a great sentence to talk with the R&D.
Yeah,
How much you will be sorry.
it came out because I was in artillery. So I had somebody talking to me about story points, and I heard story points. I said, "That sounds really interesting. Tell me more." And you have no idea what I was talking about. But eventually, this developed into this idea based on research and other discussions, and we came up with that idea.
Of course, nice one. So we have another question by Chaim. So Chaim is asking, how do you consider and evaluate risk regarding open source, like module, system, public libraries, GitHub, etc.? Is there any other way of threat modeling this kind of open source models?
Yeah, I'm gonna kind of like rephrase this, right? I'm not trying to evaluate risk in general for all open source. That's, it's its own issue. But if you're talking about a specific library or framework or whatever, a piece of open source that you want to embed in your system, you can absolutely build a threat model around that component and understand what threat scenarios are relevant to you. I like to use the example of Log4j, right? Um, Before we knew there was the the Log4Shell issues of a couple of years ago, you're basically implementing a third-party open source component to do logging for you, right? In your system, as part of your system. If you have that as an explicit part of your threat model, and you understand, well, oh, there's this third-party component that I have no control over and I don't know what it actually does, and then you start analyzing it, and you start looking for, trying to elicit possible threat scenarios around that component, you'd actually find things like elevation of privileges. Is it possible to execute code? And then you might realize that, whoa, I don't actually know what the component does with this completely unvalidated, untrusted input from the public internet. And I send this to some code and it's doing some kind of processing there. I don't know. And you realize you have an assumption, a very almost explicit assumption that you have no idea what this component is doing with this untrusted data. And then you might want to put a sandbox around it. You might want to start investigating how that actually works. You might want to put on some controls around it and realize that, oh, there's actually some configurations that are more risky, right? And putting it in that context of that threat model gives you the tools to start analyzing, well, what can go wrong there? Because we understand how it works.
Okay, thank you for that. Very, very insightful. I think, it's expand our mind and expand the elaboration. Eventually ask questions, ask questions, don't hesitate. And there is a methodology, threat modeling. So guys, if you have, thank you very much, Avi. If you have any further question to Avi, feel free to write it in the chat and the Q&A. We will also keep time at the end of the meetup. If you have any further question, we'll stay and answer all your questions. So feel free. Thank you very much, Avi. Very insightful. I learned several points that I can improve in our threat modeling in my day-to-day work with R&D teams, and love your tiger. Very nice. Okay, thank you very much.